So we have four, and we'll start with Rob Mcgowan, who's now Deputy Commander at Stratcom. You know, a huge amount of operational experience, but not just military. One of his key ones was building 30 Commando information exploitation group and take them to Helmand. He was in DI, personnel joint, Navy, you name it. Most notably, what most of you don't know is Rob is a very good cook. And he did, and is able to inhale a loaf of bread in seconds, which is distinctly Royal Marine capability. We also have Jerry. Jerry's with us. Jerry's background is as a PWO, Principal Warfare Officer, sort of surface warfare officer right the way through. He's commanded numerous ships, task groups, aircraft carriers, and most of you will have seen him on the telly bringing Queen Elizabeth, the ship, out of build, on trials, and then into service. He's been the fleet commander for about a year now. Interestingly, he's also the joint commander for the North Atlantic, which is something that most people don't really get about his job, which actually at the moment is one of the most testing theatres of operation that we can find, and is here representing Navy Command. Chris is a Royal Engineer by background, DCGS since August last year. Again, a huge operational experience. You name it, he's been there and done it. One of the most interesting things he did was taking 8 Force Engineering Brigade in command, and then taking it to Afghanistan for a tour there. So again, enormous experience. And again, we have Andrew Turner at the end, DCOM in the RAF, a Helo pilot, you know, over 5,000 hours. Interestingly, nearly 2,000 hours of those were on 19 operational tours. You know, there is a huge amount of experience. And so what you've got up here is not a community of information operators. You know, this is not the SIX community talking to you. This is operational experience. You know, there's more than a century worth of operational experience up here, which is, I suppose, a little bit scary. But there's a huge amount of operational experience, and this is the drive that we wanted to hear. This is what strategic integration means for them. What can it do for them? What are they perhaps worried about? And what should the limits be? So I think there are some interesting questions. They've got 5 minutes each, and we're going to be fairly ruthless. And then we'll move into the challenge, and then over to you. So, Rob, can I ask you to start off?
Thanks, Peter. It doesn't matter, but is there a slide?
There you go.
There it is. Brilliant, thank you. So 5 to 7 minutes, no more. So I'm deliberately going to come down a level and talk about the operational level of the 3 priorities that we talked about. They're in the brochure, but the one I really want to talk about is multi-domain integration. And having been in the job for 10 minutes, the thing that people say to me is, what exactly is multi-domain integration? So if I paint a picture, that could be the North Atlantic. It doesn't have to be, but there are 4 domains up there. There's clearly maritime, there's air, there's space, and there's defensive cyber. And there are an awful lot of platforms up there, and a lot of them are actually quite new or coming into service. So we've got plenty of platforms, we've got plenty of capability, and we've got plenty of data flows, but there are a whole bunch of questions that we're probably not asking, which is, what about the data links between the domains? What about the data hosting environments? What about the design of those data hosting environments? What about the identity access management system to allow certain individuals into that hosting environment? What about the hosting capacity? What about the applications for sophisticated analysis of the bulk data, which is going to be created in that multi-domain environment? What about the command and control and the agility of the command and control architecture to ensure we can make the right decision at the right time in the right place? And this is all, in this particular case, 4 domains, but it could be 5. I don't believe we're asking all of those questions. We've asked some of them, and we've got answers to some of them, but it's not complete. And there are a number of us, probably me included, who don't even really know what questions to ask, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, Charlie Fortey's in the audience, Phil Jones is in the audience, James Morley's in the audience. This is their space to try and define that space and define those questions for us. But the more we collect, the more platforms there are in the domains, then the more complex it becomes, but the richer the operational opportunity. That's the whole point. The reason we've got all this is because it gives us a richer operational opportunity. Now, I'm here within Strategic Command, but I'm as interested in speaking as I am listening to my colleagues on my right and my left. We're not here for Strategic Command's benefit. We're here for a collective benefit. So what I've done is I've written down 2 or 3 questions for myself as we listen to the conversations going on to the left and the right. So, for example, how can we make the future commando force more potent by ensuring it can access data at the edge, that it can be globally deployed, and it can reach back to UK and allies to access bulk data, including through a satellite link? How can we ensure the Army's Strike Brigade is linked to satellite intelligence feeds and networked into cyber effects? How can we ensure that Air Command's 6th generation fighter can talk to a Type 45 destroyer and prosecute ballistic missile defense operations to protect the carrier? They may not be the right questions, but I'm not sure we're asking them all in the right way. Or maybe it's all of those questions plus another 6 or 7. I haven't mentioned the UK intelligence community, I haven't mentioned the US, I haven't mentioned the Home Office or the Foreign Office. So as soon as we start laying those on, it becomes quite complex. There's quite a lot already going on across the TLBs in this space, and I think within Strategic Command, it's our collective responsibility to find out what those things are and bring them together. A lot of people are doing artificial intelligence exploration, probably after thematically similar things, being able to run algorithms across bulk data to start to predict patterns. That's really what we're trying to do here, to predict where certain submarines are. Well, if we're all doing that in our own domains, we should pull that together, because it's for the benefit of defence, not for the benefit of that single service. It's not a competition. This integrated review is not a competition. It's about making sure that we deliver the right effect at the right place. We've already talked about the layers, but I think there are 5 or 6 layers. There's the purple skip layer. There's an absolute requirement to ensure Strategic Command is not a purple skip and getting what we call the higher level budget holders talking to each other for operational benefit. There's a pan-TLB conversation. There's a conversation with our intelligence community partners and across government more widely. There's a conversation absolutely with the US. And there's a conversation with our allies as well. That multi-domain integration gets more and more complex. And finally, if somebody said to me, you can say 4 or 5 things about what you actually need, well, 2 or 3 things have already been mentioned. We've talked about the richness of the people that we're going to have to recruit and retain, and through this unified career management structure we have in Strategic Command, we're going to get after that. But that's going to be different to probably what we've recruited before. We still need warfighters, but we need cyber coders as well. Edward has talked about experimentation and synthetics. We need to be much more agile in our wargaming, in our ability to predict these sorts of scenarios and go after them to inform what sort of capabilities we need. And we talked about design integration, we've talked about design authority, and Charlie and Edward talked about that. We need to be flexible, but we need to set those tough entry standards into this domain. We must set that tough identity access management system, otherwise we won't be trusted when we're in it. But don't forget, we don't own all of this space. A lot of this space is owned by other people, either within government, with the agencies, or particularly the US. So it's a much more complex game. And the 3 or 4 additional things I would say is we need education. We need senior officers and officials, Luddite no more. They've got to be able to talk the talk here. They've got to understand the complexity of the information space and become information warriors, as well as their background. The senior US officers and officials are really good at this. And that education journey for senior people, because the younger people, they grow up with it. That's already started. And we shouldn't be ashamed to be on it. And we shouldn't be ashamed to admit where we might be a little bit unsighted. We absolutely need cloud. We need cloud at official, we need cloud at secret, and we need cloud at above secret. And we're working in all those areas to deliver that. Why? We need the computing power and the richness of applications and the services, including at the edge, to be able to deliver this sort of thing. And we're developing capabilities, certainly at official, and working with our partners at above secret, and we're really trying to get after secret as well. But that's a critical part of underpinning this, which we must get after. And the final thing I'll say, and I don't know if Jim Hockenall's in the audience, he may well touch on this when he speaks later, is intelligence and analysis. Yeah, we need a dedicated core of intelligence and analysis, but we also need it as a service. We'll call you. We'll call you on Tuesday and ask for a particular type of capability, but we don't need you again until Saturday. Or we need a broader conversation with industry about a more dedicated service, a broader service to do what is a mass of work to go after this problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Jerry.
Right, thanks very much. First thing I'll say, thanks to General Patrick for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. And I hope to say I'm going to be quite parochial and quite maritime focused. I think that's my role today, alongside my learned colleagues. But thank you very much. Jerry Kidd, I'm the Fleet Commander, obviously based down in Portsmouth. There are a few thoughts I'd like to put by in the next 5 minutes, and I want to end on a specific current example, which I think neatly brings together my view of all things nice and spice in terms of the integration issue. Of course, there's no strict definition, I've just found out, or indeed doctrine written about integration. We have the IOPC, we talked about earlier with Ed, but fundamentally for a military man like myself, it's deeply unsettling at last, and of course downright disorientating at worst. But for the FLC, like the Navy Command, what does this mean? Well, one person's integration means one thing to one person and another thing to another. Does it mean, as I talked to a colleague yesterday who said, integration is great, he said, but that to me means a loss of authority and responsibility. I think that is extremely harsh, and I don't subscribe to it whatsoever. It is about an enterprise approach. It is about a carapace of coherence to make us one entity. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's not a trite point. It's just damn difficult to get after. We've had the zeitgeist of integration now on the back of fusion, comprehensive, of course joint is long in the tooth now, but fundamentally, to my view, the philosophy is all about the same thing. It's about making us becoming a Swiss watch where the cogs are synchronmeshed and geared properly. Really, really tricky to do. For me, it's about winning, and Ed picks up on this point. Let's no cut about it. This is about competition, whether it's engagement today, potential conflict tomorrow. This is all about a competitive space, and that's the game we're in. So today and tomorrow, it's about winning. So what's the requirement for integration from my perspective? It's pretty clear. We're up against it. Anyone thinks that we have sunrise, sunset in this, the fact we can operate with impunity, the fact we are in a decadent era where we can do our choosing, where we can seek to act at a time and place where we wish, is just rubbish. Andrew Monahan calls it the Barracuda theorem, particularly with Russia right now, which I'm dealing with every day, is that they sort of creep up on behind you and they say, boo. They also shout boo, but then they strike you in the stomach at the same time. But we don't have good enough 360 SA, to be frank, so we are up against it. Secondly, operational advantage is narrow, and in some areas it's being crossed. We are not as good as we think we are, and certainly we don't have the decadence of where we were perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, particularly in tech, particularly in cyber, particularly in doctrine, training, across the board actually. It's quite tense. Sub-threshold, the General picked up on that. Absolutely testing us, whether it's my area in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, through to the first island chain in South China, the Northern Sea route off the top of Russia, or indeed how the Russians are acting currently in the Atlantic. Sub-threshold is really testing us in the Western norms. Our orthodoxy, if you like, is just not good enough. And of course, we have a lack of mass that must be mitigated. And there's just not enough time. And the other big one for me is industry. In all this issue about integration, industry is a massive, massive factor for me from the maritime side, as it is probably for air and land too. But I tell you now, if I could integrate one better area, it would be industry. And of course, there's not enough cash. But the good news is, I think everyone else is in the same boat, even Russia. Although I do have a wager, having just got back from China, whether they are certainly in a better place in some areas. So integration for me is not just about the seams. connections, authorities. It's about the optimization of the end-to-end kill chain, from policy right down through generation, through to training, people, and onto operations itself. For me, it's all about minimizing the decision cycle to give us operational advantage to ensure that when asked, we can win, or at least we can hold our own in the sub-threshold environment. So to deliver strategic integration, we must ensure it's across strategic, yes, but also operational and tactical. And I know this is going to be a rubbish analogy, but it's like a fruit salad boy at the strategic level, a fruit bowl at the strategic level, a fruit salad at the operational level, and it must be a fruit smoothie at the tactical level. And I think some of you may understand what I mean there. That's rubbish. I just wrote that this morning.
As the least notable point.
I suppose the more orthodox person would say it's about the three pillars of fighting power: conceptual, physical, and moral. But for me, it's about maintaining that tempo of success. So it's not just about kit or big pieces of equipment, tanks, ships, and aircraft. It's about a shift in mindset. You can't surge trust. You can't surge relationships. And at the end of the day, whatever you think about tech, it's still a human game. It's still kinetic. And I think we have to understand that the more actors you have in the integration pot, the more you have to accept ambiguity. And in the military mindset, we're not very good at ambiguity. We like the 98% solution all the time. We have to shift our mindset quite quickly. Joint has been a challenge, let alone integration. Processes must change. We talked about joint warfare and the role of JFC in this, STRATCOM in this, particularly in preparation and training of our force development work across experimentation. Absolutely vital. We must get amongst it, not least to educate ourselves in the art of the possible. I'm still learning every day. How often do we involve industry in our exercises? Very rarely. Resupplying ammunition, making sure that third or those number 3 washer that goes in a nuclear submarine power plant can be delivered to Faslane onto an aircraft to keep the submarine at sea, etc., etc. And information management, a complete disaster in some areas at the moment. Knowing the data we have today is a challenge enough, let alone how to use it in the future. So wrapping up there is about a culture shift, and we talked about that earlier. It's damn tricky. I'm going to end now on probably one for me that's the epitome and very much a metaphor as far as I can see for strategic integration, and that's the North Atlantic. As Peter has already said, I'm the Joint Commander for the North Atlantic and the High North, or should I say Integrated Commander now. I'm the supported commander for that, and it's a great privilege. But my word, it's tricky work at the moment. At the heart of it is the continuous at-sea deterrent, and wrapped around it is a pretty hodgepodge alchemy ingredients across all sorts of actors, not least allies and partners. And it's a difficult one to meld together and synchromesh together. It's achingly complex, it's complicated and dynamic. The op advantage in the Atlantic has gone. We are seriously pressed by the Russians at the moment. And the only way we're going to buy ourselves out of that is to approach it in a truly integrated way. The good news is we're making great leaps and bounds there. We've never really grappled with it properly because we've always enjoyed that op advantage. It is non-discretionary for the UK. It is absolutely persistent. We've been at it since 1946, and we're still going here in 2020, 50 years with CASD last week. It is absolutely joint, always has been. It is very much combined, not least with the United States and the French, but now we're wrapping in much more effectively the trans-agencies, special forces, maritime special operations, all the elements of cross-Whitehall levers we can get, tech, and of course that leads us into the sunset-sunrise theorem. It's all very well, but as a frontline command, I must keep the wheels on the bus, and therefore I do want a torch with batteries going from the sunrise to maintain credibility. And the last one about the North Atlantic is it's a national effort. Indeed, it's an international effort. And I think that, for me, is the heart of integration. It's the epitome of multi-domain because it stretches around the globe. That's it, all from me. A whole bunch of stuff. I think I'm 5.5 minutes. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Peter. Again, General, thank you very much for allowing me to come up on the stage. I mean, I guess two things I would just say to start with. Firstly, as we head into the integrated review, I would observe, despite scuttlebutt, that I'm going to say my colleagues, but actually my friends more importantly, absolutely know that success looks like us doing this together to deliver the right result, both for defence, but frankly also for the country. So it's essential, we recognise that, and we are already, as we do anyway, working very closely together, and that will continue to be the case. The second thing I would just say as we start to touch on integration from the Army's perspective is that I would observe that the defence is pretty good actually about bringing together disparate parts. And of course, we launched the Permanent Joint Headquarters in 1996, and I would say that has absolutely stood the test of time in terms of delivering success on operations, be it Iraq, Afghanistan, or anywhere else. So there is a track record, but I think as we've already heard this morning, and I think we would all recognise, the challenge for us is more challenging as we head into the next decade in terms of genuinely integrating in an era of constant competition when, as we've agreed, being joint is frankly just not enough. So what I will give you, I hope in the next 5 minutes, is the Army's perspective about how we think collectively we should tackle these challenges based, of course, on the threats that we face. And it is important, I would suggest, that in everything we discuss, we continue to go back to those threats. Otherwise, there is a danger that we will kid ourselves in terms of what good looks like. Ed has already talked about Defence's integrating operating concept, and as he has already alluded to, we have written the Army or the land operating concept to nest into that, and that has gone through the various hoops it needs to create that building block. Although it is still held within Defence, I absolutely recognise that at the moment. But I would say that on the back of that, and as we head into the integrated review, there are two things really that will shape, for want of a better phrase, our proposition as we go into that review. First of all, that in an era of constant competition, first we must, as an army or in the land environment, be able to sense and act quicker than we currently can at the moment. And that goes back to this term speed of relevance, which many of you will recognise. And in order to do that, we need to be persistently engaged in order to anticipate the threats as they emerge. And of course, then we need to be able to, as I say, affect at speed. Secondly, we cannot affect or we cannot deliver any of that in isolation. And consequently, integration must be hard-baked into everything that we are doing, both within the land environment, but of course across defence. And that's, frankly, the power not only of Strategic Command, but specifically of this conference as well. And that's, without that integration, we will not unlock, I would say, in the land domain, our competitive advantage. So within the Army operating concept, or the land operating concept, we have identified 7 facets, themes of integration on which we will build out from. The first and most obvious, given the audience and what we're talking about, is to ensure that we integrate truly across the 5 domains. That absolutely needs to be led by Strategic Command, but we need to make sure we have got greater symbiosis between sovereign maritime, air, cyber and space capabilities. Secondly, we need to be able to integrate and continue to integrate seamlessly with our allies. This, of course, requires continued investment in technical, procedural and human interoperability with our closest partners. Self-evidently for that, we continue to work extremely closely with the United States, and I am actually going out tomorrow to go and chat further with the Secretary of the Army to talk about how we can double down on some of those aspects. Thirdly, in terms of integration, is the slightly hackneyed phrase now, but critical, of blending hard and soft effects. Many of you will know the great work that is going on within 6th Division at the moment, And that, of course, is something that has been a leader, certainly within the land environment, and I would suggest wider. Going back to the United States, I know they are extremely interested in the work that goes on there. But, of course, what we've got to do is export that beyond just the boundaries, if I can call it that, of 6div into the whole force. And the critical nature of the single information environment is one of the ways that we will get after that. The fourth area of integration is one of manned and unmanned teaming. I'll talk about experimentation in a minute, but we have got to make sure that manned and unmanned teaming is the norm as we head into the next decade. Certainly for me and the direction that I have given to the Director of Capability and his team is that manned-unmanned teaming absolutely should be the norm in terms of the land environment by the mid to late 20s. That absolutely will drive changes within the equipment program. But if we don't think like that, we will continue, going back to the Minister's point, I think, to describe a landscape that looks remarkably similar to perhaps a few years ago. What I would say, though, in terms of that manned-unmanned teaming, is that, of course, the human interface in the land environment will still remain incredibly important. And Jerry just talked about that. And there is therefore a balance between what that manned-unmanned teaming can offer versus actually what we need to protect in terms of that human interface. Fifth, in terms of integration, and this was touched on earlier, is our ability to integrate with other government departments and specialists. We know that we did, I would say, pretty well, actually, certainly in Afghanistan and towards the back end of Iraq. The danger when we're not on operations is that can tend to slip into abeyance, stand fast for some of those niche capabilities, but we need to continue to double down on that and really get after, as we've heard earlier, Whitehall's fusion doctrine to really bring meaning to it. Sixthly, and again, referring back to what Jerry talked about, is our relationship with industry. We have got to integrate better from them from the outset. You will have heard us talk previously about prototype warfare, and some of you that were Integrated Warrior last week will know that we are spending some £300 million over the 3 years on the Autonomous Warrior series of programs, and that is getting industry absolutely at the front door of our thinking and our development, which I think, from the feedback I'm getting back from industry, is it's having a hugely catalytic and important effect, but we need to continue to do more of that, and that, of course, requires absolute trust on both sides. And, of course, there are then spin-offs in terms of prosperity, which I suspect will be one of the themes of the integrated review, which I think we, certainly in the land environment, have lagged behind my colleagues in the other two services. But I would suggest, as I hesitate to say this, get over the hump of some of the challenges we've had in terms of approvals within the land environment, there are opportunities coming that we really do and will exploit. And finally, the seventh area of integration that we are focusing on is that with society. We have, as you well know, a very well-established footprint across the UK landmass, and we need to continue to exploit that, not just for our own purposes, but for all of us across defence, and drive hard into the opportunities that STEM, youth engagement, and others can offer. Before closing, I would just reiterate one thing, and that is about the critical nature of the digital backbone. We are working very hard at that in conjunction with Strategic Command. We have a thing called Project Thea, which is our Army's digital transformation project, but we need to do that in conjunction with the other services. Final point, I am optimistic about the integrated review. I think we are absolutely in lockstep in terms of our approach, and I am actually, dare I say it, quite looking forward to the year ahead, because I think we can make a difference.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. And General, again, thank you for your offer of an opportunity to share the platform here today. It's really both powerful and a great opportunity. And I'd echo Chris's point there about the way in which, for the last 30 years, the four of us have actually grown up together, both on operations at home, in staff and in command at home. So it's a tremendously great time to be on the panel here. I have a slide, actually. I don't know if it's available, if you can put the second slide up. I wanted to talk to you about not what I'm doing in the Royal Air Force, but also just some really points where I think we can talk together about where capability integration might be going between us and you in particular, Edward. I mean, the first thing is, when looking at 5-domain integration, I posed the question at Integrated Warrior from my rather remote location, which is I'm not sure what it really is. I mean, we've got a great system in the centre of government around the National Security Council, around the NSIG structure with the National Security Advisor to deliver that national strategic and geostrategic alignment of national levers of power. And similarly, you've got a fantastic headquarters with Ben down in Northwood to deliver that operational and the tactical level stuff, which I think is really fantastic. So the way I thought 5-domain integration might be most valid for us is through the pre-conflict capability integration across the services and the domains. So I have some points here, which will come in a second, which relate to 5 areas which I think we need to be thinking about in greater detail. These are prompts for ourselves. These are things that we're working on, but they're areas which I think we all ought to be concerned with. The first one, I was with Sir Simon Bolam down in Bristol yesterday talking about digital twin development. So we are moving into a place and a position where we simply want to get after our new equipment far quicker than we currently and historically have. So we need to be moving in the air domain to flight-free certification of new platforms and aircraft, missiles and weapons. So we need to be moving to an area and a domain and a pace that is way outstrips where we've historically been, that will bring forward capability, allow us to choose between where risk might lie on the front line or an acquisition at a pace that is far, far quicker than we've historically delivered. So digital twin development, I think, is critical, but it does play into the SSE, Edward, I think, in the sense of generating a framework of reference around the adversaries that we face in a pre-conflict and post-conflict phase, in protect, constrain, engage, and fight if necessary, such that we can game and war game things at a pace and a frequency that is way quicker than we've historically done. It's not about China graphs and Excel spreadsheets and maps and talc. It should be about moving data at 30,000 iterations overnight to generate Gaussian curves of where possibilities and opportunities might lie. The second point relates to this compartmented tier 1 to 4 idea, that there's much, if not all, of our emerging and fielded capability we simply don't want to demonstrate, test or train with in the live environment. Its components and signatures and the way it interacts and it's complementary together is such that it cannot be used in the public domain. I was lucky enough to fly a B-2 recently, and they waited until the Chinese Earth-observing satellite was over the airbase before they dragged the aircraft out and showed me in an English flying suit getting into it. So there is a genuine benefit to the opportunity of strategic communications in this regard, but there's an amazing benefit in strategic signalling too, and we should be careful of that. It takes me to my a sort of wider threat and risk that we're facing, which is essentially the area of ubiquitous Earth sensing by satellites, and mainly in the Chinese domain. You know, if the numbers in the second picture on the right-hand side are anything like where we are, you won't be able to move without it being seen, codified, and passed to Beijing or any other strategic capital. If that be the case, then the days of tactical and operational surprise in the physical domain are over, and they've finished. We need to be quicker and more agile with our ability to act and operate at the speed of light. And I think that, for me, is this area where General Goldfein and General Raymond are talking about man on the loop and not man in the loop. This is a domain and space where we allow the speed of light to pass data around to generate choice and opportunity, and then act when the time and place is of our choosing. We need to see the threats and risks which are posed to us, like A2AD, as opportunities for us to impose on others. So we should be thinking about these not as risks that we need to overcome and adapt to, but opportunities for us to pass to our adversaries and enemies ahead and in time of need, in all the 4 frames of the IAPC 25 space. You touched earlier, Edward, on cognitive maneuver. I'm a big fan of this. Phil Tetlow's book on super forecasting is a really good read. It tells you that there's a group of people who can genuinely predict the future at a higher degree of probability than any SME. And when added together, they can aggregate to a point where they can get to very high levels of probability. Now, if you apply this at strategic leaders and try and game and maneuver through warfare and try and adapt the places and people that we're likely to be up against, you could get to a point where you can start to pose those dilemmas ahead of the opportunities being passed to our adversaries' leadership, remove choice and canalize them into certain points of action and activity. These are possible in the financial domain. It's done through algorithmic management and manipulation in the city, day-to-day, overnight, in the London trading regimes. It's done in commercial, manufacturing and software development. We ought to be thinking about it in terms of the defence and security framework. I also think that whilst we're talking about this, we talk a lot about data being, a critical risk to us, but actually there are emerging technologies which are available to us today which would take us to new domains. The ideas, Charlie, of quantum key encryption are material, they're upon us today, and that would make our systems robust and resilient to almost any intrusion, as in they can't be intruded. Quantum key encryption will also tell us and show us where others are intruding on our networks at the same time and pace, so we'll be able to give ourselves that information advantage that we're really seeking in this domain. At the same time, the sensor in the bottom left-hand corner, the square is 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters. It is a diamond valency incongruity sensor. So this is quantum sensing deployed, fielded, and available today. Now, if we can move to an area of diamond valency sensing, then we're definitely in a place where the nature of warfare has shifted to a new domain. No longer do we need 60,000 satellites in the LEO orbit to try and to deliver persistent surveillance. We can just put 1 or 2 up in the geostationary orbit and surveil the domains that we're after to provide ubiquitous self-sensing of our adversaries and enemies. So I sort of think that data is the key terrain, and data warfare might be the direction of travel we need to be going on. But I would say that my thoughts are that the IOPSI future should be our target. I genuinely think GST has been outdone in its 6th edition now by its failure to be able to predict far enough ahead and to stay apace with how developments have moved on. But I genuinely think the targets and ideas you have in IOPSI future should be where we should be looking at for IOPSI 25. Because I think the movement, the price point and the opportunities will move in that direction. And to your point, Juliet, earlier on, just so you're clear, we think that in our service of 30,000, we need 5,000 different people today. That's not in 5 years, that's today. 2,000 coders, 1,000 information warfare, and 2,000 involved directly in space. So it's big changes we're after. The structure of the business is moving, and no longer does 71 branches and trades, is it fit or right for the Royal Air Force today? We need 11 professions which are engaging with commercial industry, with our civilian counterparts and our civil service equivalents. So I'll leave my comments there and we'll take questions if you're happy.
Thank you very much. Well, there we've heard the pitch from all four. I'm going to go immediately to the challenge panel. And who wants to kick us off? Teresa.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel. Can you hear me?
It's coming on now.
Okay. I get this impression it's almost like a panopticon. But what happens if you get blinded? We're talking all about this technology. And we know China since, 7, 8 years ago, one of the first things they were able to do was to destroy satellites. So I know we have the strategic command narrative and how to make it work, but I know the US Navy, for example, is learning how to navigate by the stars because they are preparing for being blinded. So what are you going to be doing to prepare for being blinded? So that's a Luddite response. I'm sure that's not what everyone wanted to hear, but to paraphrase a famous strategist, technological plans until you meet friction. So we have to think about the anti-satellite technology. I know we're also talking about sub-threshold, but that wouldn't happen unless there was some sort of, if God forbid, things escalate. A colleague at Oxford is doing a project now on prediction. And I'll have to read this book that you mentioned, but he said that his dog Sprockets could actually predict better than most experts. So we often get it wrong. So if we're going to count so much on all this technology and AI, it's only as good as the data that we put into it. And I mean, let's face it, no one predicted the demise of the Soviet Union, so we're not very good at that. Third point, personnel, strategic command. I sit in Brussels and I know this idea of loyalties. I know the UK is very joined up, which is great, but how will you promote personnel? How do you find people's loyalties? Everyone has to worry about their budgets and protecting their interests. So how do you expect to get around maybe loyalty issues for various services? And that's what I meant. What do you do if Alexa has been blinded or been attacked by Stuxnet? I mean, we are relying so much on the cloud. That's what I'm worried about, and poisoned data. And then I just have to comment. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't comment about the op-ed in today's Financial Times by Gideon Rockman mentioning Huawei. Now, we had a discussion last night at dinner about core and periphery, and it seems that the UK seems to recognize that there's a difference between core and periphery in 5G, but many experts don't agree that in 5G there is no core and there's no periphery, it's all the same. So we've seen Australia, Japan, even Vietnam not using Huawei. So this really begs the question about the UK's position. So maybe you can just briefly touch on that. Thanks.
Right, so we're going to get two of you to answer each of these because we're quite pressed for time and the people in the audience who want to kick off. There are a variety of comments there. Can I get Andrew to answer, just take a couple of those points?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll take the first two if I can, because I think I'll leave the third one to the Prime Minister, if that's all right. The first one on blinded. I mean, it's a really good point, but I think what we don't quite realise is that our national vulnerability, all nations' vulnerability to threat and disruption in space. So the journey that we're on, the Combined Space Operators Principles Board was last week in Ottawa, which I attended with the other 6 nations, where we are trying to sort of generate the insight amongst government, amongst our public and populations about the vulnerability that we stand to in this area. So to a certain extent, you know, we need to be comfortable with the fact that all of our nations are in a very similar place. But you're right that we need to be able to revert certain cases and places to operate at the level where space assets have been denied. But I don't think we should be remotely conscious of any sort of sense of insulation around the idea of loss of space in a day in war or a day in economics. I think the national insurance agencies now currently insure against 24 hours without space, and it is billions per company if you really want to underwrite the data loss. So partly this is about a journey about trying to navigate to a place where space is codified in a similar way to chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons. It is a threshold which is beyond where we really, really don't want to go because the consequences are so grave. To your point about forecasting, so without advertising the book, and I'll obviously be buying yours, Jim, if you read the forecasting book, it absolutely says experts are rubbish. In fact, what it does say is experts are less able to predict than monkeys. What it does say, though, if you're a professional forecaster and you go about forecasting through a much more predictive lens with a much more codified set of steps with a wide reference network, you can get to not 44%, as the book would set out for you, but more like 78 to 82% if you have a group of people. So I'm advocating the position that you are able to do more than we can today. And tied that with clever high-speed computers, AI, we've gone in our world from a position in the 1980s where there were lies, damn lies, and weather reports. Now you can get a reasonably accurate prediction of the weather 3, 5, 7 days out. And so this has been because supercomputers, firstly at Bracknell, now in Exeter, have developed the ability to compute models, remove the sensitivity analysis for 100 k-squares down to 10 meters in cases to generate that accuracy. So I think we should be careful about dismissing the idea of forecasting as an opportunity that we might better harness for ourselves.
Thanks. And Chris?
Yeah, so if I go back to those same 2 points, I mean, the reason why I talked about the threat is because clearly the enemy, for want of a better phrase, has a vote. And we are absolutely determined, and I would suggest for the integrated review, it is fundamental to understand what that threat looks like and the sorts of capabilities that we're talking about. And, you know, in sort of parochial old speak, we need reversionary modes, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the other point is we also need to make sure we're not mesmerized by technology. So one of the sort of ways we are trying to red team ourselves is to make sure that we don't put the crown jewels in the wrong place or just in one place, so that actually we can react to events. But I think it's a very, very salient point that we need to keep aware of.
It's interesting is that in that recruitment for coders, of course, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple have stopped recruiting coders because they have enough. And actually, as they put it, the era of the master coder is dead. No longer do we need coders. We need humanities students. We need dentists. We need chemists. We need lots and lots of different people to come into this. But we don't need the coders. We've got enough coders, and actually we're clever enough, so actually move on. So you may well find that your coders aren't so much of a problem as perhaps we think they are. But on to that, who's next? Jim?
Yeah, result. An Air Marshal is about to make me £1.15 richer. Sir, thank you very much. I hope the ladies in the audience...
9p, wasn't it? I thought.
I hope the ladies in the audience will not take offence, but if you want an insight into human nature, ask a lady of easy virtue. And to paraphrase Mandy Rice Davis, he would say that, wouldn't he? What we've seen includes admissions of acceptable weaknesses that they'll all admit to in public. And I'd like, Peter, if you could direct this to 2 of the single services only. To quote Chris Tickle, we are all in lockstep. Are we really expected to believe that everything in the garden is, was, and will be rosy? Are we really expected to think that the Royal Navy, the Army, and the RAF think that strategic command is marvellous and an unalloyed good? And before they reply, I'd go back to Mandy Rice Davis. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he?
Okay, I guess that's a sort of reasonable challenge in that, you know, aside from some of the language, you paint a beautiful picture, you know, that it is all seamless and wonderful, and maybe you do believe in that head mark together, but are we saying, honestly, there is no friction? Because there must be, surely. Chris?
Yeah, I won't correct spelling my name, but the yeah, of course there's friction. I mean, it would be naive to think there wasn't. And there'll be disagreements. I mean, Andy and I were talking about something we were emailing each other over last night. But that's not the same thing as not understanding that if we don't focus on the outcomes as opposed to the inputs, that we won't get to the right place. And we won't all come out of the integrated review going, everything, we nailed it all 4 of us are happy, because that's not the nature of the beast. But what we've got to recognise is, frankly, the greater good, and understand that there is going to be compromises required along the line. And actually, going back to a specific point, Jim, about strategic command, the key thing that in my previous guise as director of capability, that with the greatest respect to the great work that was going on, was that true integration wasn't, I would suggest, happening. There were some great individual bits going, but that horizontal integration was, in my humble view, lacking, even though people were talking about it. The fact that we are now getting after it is brilliant. But again, it doesn't mean that the world is rosy now. Of course it doesn't. But that's the journey, for want of a better phrase, we've got to go on.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think it's I hate to say it's a bit of a cliche question in many ways, Jim. I don't want to be rude there, but I think, as Chris rightly says, it's naive in the extreme to think that we're not all products of our history. We have passion for our cloth, and so that's something we should be proud of. We should champion, actually, in a way, because the strength of any building is in its individual pillars. The fact we hold up the same roof, in a crude analogy. And we're human, we're passionate about things, and we want everything to be good, amazingly 99% correct, and ready to rock and roll. There's a great store in resilience and having your own service looking really, really Rolls Royce. But I think the understand piece is important here. I think we all understand that money is a restrictive resource. We're operating under a particular fiscal budgetary constraint coming up, and we have many other national priorities apart from defence. We all recognise that. But nevertheless, the national imperative here is one we must really be careful to focus on. And I think that's where the joint understanding, the joint lexicon, and the philosophy that we're taking ahead through Stratcom is right. It has to be. My word, I'd like to have 5 aircraft carriers, but I've only got 2. But Stratcom, therefore, is a great leveller. And I think, not to be laughing, it's becoming more of an agent of defence, not just a cross-cutting enabler. And I think that philosophy is now seeping through right down to tactical levels. And certainly I've got no issues with the integration philosophy being rolled out. And that, as Chris rightly says, will mean compromise. And the Navy Command is definitely up to take some pain for the collective good. I mean that hand on heart.
I guess that was where I was going to come to, because the extension beyond the words is, would the guys in Andover be content that in order to fulfil some of these objectives of a beautiful single information environment, that you lose armour? But as an example, it's that willingness to accept pain which gets to some of those shibboleths that you know, that people have talked about before. These are, you know, if it is as tight, we've seen this before. Is that necessarily? And I'm not asking specifically about, you know, armour, but that willingness to take, you know, really difficult, big capability decisions. Do you think that appetite is there?
I mean, I absolutely do, and I would say the lived experience in Andover over the last few years is that that's exactly what we've been doing.
So let me take that a step further. If then the priorities of Strategic Command are sufficient, that they can argue the case and deem almost what is important, is there not an argument, therefore, that Strategic Command sits above and determines what the subordinate elements of the other single services are?
No, because this is about, well, I would say this is about integration. This isn't about a primus inter pares. I mean, you know, we used to have or have at the moment, but supported, and that's not necessarily the right construct. But defence is about the totality of the sum of the parts. It isn't about a single domain or a single service being that primus inter pares. It is about the totality of the effect. And that will change depending on the circumstances, and most importantly, depending on the threat, I would suggest.
Okay. Juliet.
So I've got a couple of points. One was around thinking and planning as a whole force, and thinking about the size and shape of the whole of the armed forces across the UK, and the role of the Strategic Command in doing that, to look beyond platform, because you do that very well in services, but looking beyond platform to think about skills. And the other thing was around the balance between upskilling your current workforce and buying in new, because the competition for talent for all of those skills you mentioned is very tight. So it's thoughts on that really, about how you equip yourselves to deal with the big questions that lie beyond platform.
And I think we also need to be more flexible in the way you can join and leave. So rather than you've got to be 17 or 18, you've got to have these A-levels or this degree to join, and then you do your term for 5 years, and you might be able to actually do 10, and if you get promoted you can do 15, and then you go. Then, and actually Chief of Defence people is absolutely responsible for determining the sort of policy, with advice from people here and across the services, to be much more attractive to people. I think we're in a much more transactional relationship with our younger people than we used to be. You know, when I joined the Royal Marines 327 years ago, you know, I was in for life. I don't think there are many people like that left, including people who want to join the Royal Marines, amazingly to me. And so we've got to develop a more transactional relationship, and if they want to go and do something else, then they can, and if they want to come back after they've been in industry and strengthen their skills, then we should do that. Can I just pick up while I've got the phone, just very briefly?
Very briefly.
Just on Huawei, because Teresa and I had a conversation about Huawei last night, and I asked that question. So I went online, I read all the stuff online. I think there's loads of stuff that's been produced by GCHQ online. There are 2 documents that are worth reading. But I asked my team, I said, how vulnerable are we? Now, clearly we can't talk about it in here, but I had a fully classified briefing that our risk to Huawei and our core networks to deliver the sort of thing we're talking about is, there's no such thing as zero risk, but it is of such a low level that we don't need to mitigate that beyond what we're already doing, just to reassure everybody.
Okay, let's go with some points question 4. Can you keep it brief, because we're sort of limited, but I've got 3 hands. Can we start over here, please, Justin? Thank you.
Richard Wardlaw, speed of relevance, acting and sensing at the speed of relevance, speed of light warfare, optimizing the decision action cycle, I think were the common themes from all 3 of the frontline commands. To the frontline commands, if that is your ambition, what is it, to really answer one of Rob's early questions, Strategic Commands needs to do? What is the pace setter, the enabler to achieve that integration? Which horse do we need to back?
Okay, so go over here, please, Justin. There's 2 more here. But in the meantime, as you're walking across, does anyone want to take that? What's the pace setter, Jerry, in terms of speed of relevance?
I'll just go to one area, which I think I'm quite conscious of. I've got Jim here in the audience. Is, for me, if we're going to sort the platforms out, we get that, is the culture setting, it's the experimentation, it's the force preparation and training. Because that is where, really, you get to the heart of getting to a faster decision cycle, understanding what you've got to play with. So I would big up massively joint warfare. Not that I've worked there. They seem to me to be dead underpowered. And I think if there's never an enzymatic place that we'd put more equity into Stratcom, it would be in joint warfare. And I imagine General Patrick's about to shoot me now, but you know, that for me can be the crucible upon which we can really start getting to the heart of understand experimentation, training, and setting the culture right.
Thank you. Right, Bill.
Bill Robbins, an exciting and elegant morning on which one thing is at the centre and on which everything depends, and that's the industrial interface. It's where the rubber hits the road. And it does seem to me that Charlie's Defence Digital Organisation, the DA question, is an absolutely vital one. But it does seem to me that we've really got to change our view as to how the commercial interface is going to work. For instance, the elegant pictures painted by Rob and the other panelists of rich data supplied globally, tactically, at theatre level and at operational level and beyond, is going to depend on intimate working with a complex set of networks operating at all those levels by different contractors who spend most of their time trying to knock spots off each other. That we've dealt with to some extent, but it does seem to me now that we are so dependent on industry that the industrial and commercial interface becomes a defence line of development, because the intimate operational involvement of industry will mean that commanders on the ground, CJO, theatre commanders, not just their J6 staffs, will be wanting to flex networks, to have large bandwidth here,
Yep.
to have the SAS kicking indoors there and no latency. Networks will have to change on a sixpence, and a new commercial construct will be vital to do that.
And interesting to say that the MOD is sometimes not the best commercial partner. There was someone behind, was it Guy? No, just there, thank you. Oh, Ben.
Ben Barry from the IISS. I look at the armed forces from outside and I see some key asymmetries. For example, the Army and the Royal Air Force in the previous decade seems to have got well ahead on the Navy on remotely operated drones. There are considerable asymmetries in reserves. But in the context of today, a really striking asymmetry is the approach to the battle of the narrative. The Army's got 77 Brigade that's been working on that for years. What I don't see is 77 Flotilla of the Royal Navy or 77 Squadron of the Royal Air Force.
Okay, thanks very much. Could you, Justin, could you go back over there to Paul again, Cornish? In the meantime, who would, I mean, Rob, you could talk about 30, Commando or Jerry, Jerry, why don't you start?
Can I
yeah,
the industry went off and I'll hand over 30 Commando, the fact that we do have a version of 77 Brigade. I think it comes back to the bit I did in my little speech about my big worry is about in the integration aspects is the industry and our reliance. And I think, behaviour is driven by incentivization, and we have to understand how we incentivize industry to enable us, to support us, because resilience and readiness just costs, So it has been really crude, the ability to move and then sustain military forces across all three of the key environmental domains is critical in industry. And I think it's a Western weakness at the moment, particularly in the expeditionary contingent space, particularly for us in the UK as we go more globalised, understanding where those weaknesses are. But your answer is absolutely right, but there's no easy win here, because it does cost, but it's about the commercial framework we set in the future, and I think we've got to be novel there and innovative, and yes, there's the power of speed of light and data deliverability, but fundamentally we still need to, at the moment, move people, heavy metal, around the planet, and the sustainment we get there. So your question's good, no easy answer. Rob?
Yeah, just on the, just to continue on with what Jerry was saying, I think defence absolutely gets that problem. And we're really hopeful that we can launch something fairly soon about it, but we're not quite there yet, which tries to at least acknowledge the problem and that we need help from industry to get after it. But what has been announced is the acquisition review, where if we're prepared to take more risk, if we're prepared to take more commercial risk, technical risk, legal risk, financial risk, capability risk, then we can be faster and more agile. And I think, well, Dominic Cummings has been quite clear about this publicly, that we're going to have to do that if we're going to spirally develop some of these capabilities in an open architectural way. If we don't, then the speed of relevance, Richard's point about the speed of relevance is not going to be there. So I think we're not there yet, but we absolutely recognise it. Can I just very quickly finish off on a point that was absolutely rightly directed at the single services? And I get the passion from being in a single service. So that is Strategic Command's challenge. Strategic Command's challenge is to go to Chris de Kell and say, your strike brigade is at 70% capability. We can get you to 95% capability, just listen to this. And that's the challenge across the totality of defence. If you're interested in single service, you're not going to have that conversation. But I think everybody said we're interested in the outputs for defence, so we want to get to that 95%.
Yeah, 2 quick points. One, to build on your point about industry. So there's a really advanced conversation with our principal aerospace industry partners. It maps across to the other parts of defence as well, which is about a new relationship, which might be an outcome of an integrated review, should it be run. So I think that's key. For me, what I need to generate is a far higher productivity of our platforms, much more agile method of resupply and maintenance in the field, smaller fleets to get more out of those fleets. So a shift from the live to the synthetic dimension, which I talked about in my comments, and also a movement to much more global points of presence, much greater sharing and usage of data and information and spares and workforces. So that industry partnership is also linking with skills transfer and civil qualifications to get a more fluid workforce inside the business. To your point, Ben, the asymmetry, we have those things. The 77 Brigade equivalent. Royal Air Force Leeming is our experimental hub for the generation of exploitation of data, intelligence, information at a pace. We've got some very interesting and novel techniques which we're trialling at the moment in Spade Adam, amongst other places. And we also have a secret place in Wiltshire where we're developing some above secret capabilities which are very much in the same space as 77 Brigade. Don't want to shout about them, but they are very advanced, and they currently lead in the United States Air Force's thinking rather than following.
Interesting, of course, the IISS, Ben, the military balance, you go back to 1989 versions, somewhere around there, you'll find the Navy and the Air Force both operating drones back then. The Navy in mine hunting. First autonomous capability that the UK had was a Royal Navy mine hunting drone. Paul.
Peter, thanks very much for coming back to me. It's just a comment really that comes to mind reflecting on Jim Stall's question. And it does seem to me, picking up some of the comments made, that of course we must expect inter-service rivalry, as we used to call it. And I'd argue that it's no bad thing. My own far distant experience tells me that it's absolutely right and proper that the army should be quietly confident of its superiority in all things. But then I'd add and vice versa, and I'd add a third vice versa for General Mcgowan, given his unshiftable alter ego. It seems to me that what actually really matters is whether that rivalry becomes disabling. And my point is that if the integrated review conforms to type, then it will focus, I'm afraid to say, on inputs, and several of the panelists have mentioned this. It will become an input-oriented review, which I think would be disastrous. It's disastrous as well if admirals and generals and air marshals, and I did get them in the right order, argue away in public about what they want for their service. And if I may say, especially if retired admirals and generals and air marshals, with great respect to all those gathered here, what that does then, it gives the image that not even these senior people in defence know what's going on and how to go about it. So we in the Treasury feel justified in shifting to the input orientation, and we go round and round the same circle again, and we end up with precisely the wrong sort of view. So it seems to me that what Strategic Command offers, and I'm an outsider, is, with this idea of integration, is precisely the opportunity to bring some sense back into this discussion, and to make the point that the value of defence lies in its outputs, not in its inputs. Thank you.
I don't think there's any need to respond there from any of the panel. I thought it was a beautifully made point. And Paul, a couple of days ago, with some others, has written a brilliant article. I can't remember which website is it on at the moment. Oh, it's on ours soon. A really stunning website, a really stunning article that was pushed out earlier this week, which is about formatting and scoping the integrated review questions. Brilliant. Normally at this stage, I give them all a minute each to sum up, but bearing in mind their penchant for speaking for more than their allotted time, I'd be holding you back. And so it just leaves me to thank them all very much indeed. I mean, it's so rare that we and Rusi can pull in such really great people who are operators to come out, each of them, for a day to spend time with us and to explain what this means to them when they have lots and lots of, much better things to do. So a huge privilege for us to have you. Thank you all very much for coming. And also to our challenge panel, which to me added some enormous value and depth to what we heard. So please, would you join me in thanking them in a traditional way?